Have you ever stopped to think about what a gunfight in the Old West was actually like? Not the slow-motion cinematic showdown you've seen 100 times in Hollywood films, where two men stare each other down on a sun-baked street while dramatic music swells in the background. Not the clean, choreographed draw, the spinning pistol, the hero walking away without a scratch. The real thing was something else entirely. Something rawer, faster, more terrifying, and far more human than anything the movies ever dared to show you. Today, we're going to strip away every myth, every romanticized frame, every fictional embellishment, and look at what a duel in the American West actually was. Second by second, nerve by nerve, heartbeat by heartbeat. The first thing you need to understand is that the classic image of two men standing 50 feet apart on an empty street, waiting for the clock to strike high noon, almost never happened. The term quick draw duel, as Hollywood defines it, was largely a creation of dime novels, and later film studios hungry for dramatic tension. Real confrontations in the West were messy, unpredictable, and often over before most bystanders even understood what was happening. The men who survived gunfights in the 1800s did so not because they were the fastest draw, but because they were the most calculating, the most cold-blooded, and frequently because they cheated first. Let's start with the men themselves. Who were the people actually involved in these confrontations? The popular image is of a lone gunslinger, a drifter with a mysterious past and a tied-down holster. The reality was far more mundane and far more dangerous. Most gunfights in the Old West involved gamblers, lawmen, outlaws, cowboys, and ordinary citizens pushed past their breaking point. Men like Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, Wild Bill Hickok, and John Wesley Hardin were not mythological figures born with supernatural reflexes. They were human beings shaped by violence, poverty, and a society that had very few mechanisms for resolving conflict peacefully. The frontier was a place where the rule of law was thin, where personal honor was currency, and where the ability to project lethal force was often the only social contract that mattered. Now consider the weapon itself. The revolver of the Old West era, most famously the Colt single-action army introduced in 1873, was a remarkable piece of engineering for its time, but it was not the precision instrument movies suggest. It was heavy, weighing nearly 2.5 pounds when loaded. It had a trigger pull that required deliberate force. It was accurate at close range, but increasingly unreliable as distance grew. Most gunfighters carried their revolvers in a simple leather holster, often without any of the quick-release mechanisms that Hollywood costumers invented. The tied-down holster, that iconic image of the gunslinger's rig strapped to the thigh, was actually more common among theatrical performers and show cowboys than among working gunmen, who found that a loose holster was perfectly adequate for the distances at which real fights occurred. And those distances matter enormously. Study after study of documented Old West gunfights reveals that the vast majority took place at extremely close range. We're talking about 10 feet, 15 feet, sometimes close enough to smell the other man's breath. At those distances, accuracy was almost secondary. What mattered was nerve, timing, and the willingness to pull the trigger before your body's own survival instincts shut you down. Because here is something the movies never tell you. The human body, when faced with genuine mortal danger, does everything in its power to prevent you from functioning effectively. Your hands shake, your vision narrows, your fine motor skills collapse. Your heart rate can spike to over 200 beats per minute in seconds. The physiological cascade of a true life-or-death confrontation is catastrophic for precision shooting. This is why the men who were genuinely dangerous in the Old West were not necessarily the fastest. They were the ones who had learned, through experience or through some terrible coldness of temperament, to function under that physiological storm. Wild Bill Hickok, arguably the most celebrated gunfighter of the era, was not known for blinding speed. He was known for deliberateness, for taking his time even when time seemed impossible, for placing his shots with a calm that witnesses described as almost inhuman. He had been in enough real confrontations to understand that the man who panics first usually dies first, regardless of how fast his draw is. Now let's walk through what a real confrontation actually looked like, moment by moment. It rarely began on a street at noon. It began in a saloon, or a gambling hall, or outside a livery stable, usually in the late afternoon or evening when men had been drinking and tempers had been running hot for hours. The trigger was almost always something that seems trivial in retrospect. A card game accusation, a debt, an insult to a man's reputation, or his woman, a dispute over cattle or land. But in a society where honor was everything and legal recourse was almost nothing, These small sparks fell on very dry tinder. The verbal confrontation would escalate. Words would be exchanged. Voices would rise. And at some point, one man would cross a line that both parties understood could not be uncrossed. This moment, this threshold, was often the most dangerous part of the entire encounter. Because the man who recognized that violence was now inevitable and acted on that recognition first had an enormous advantage. Many of the most celebrated gunfighters of the era were, by modern standards, what we would call preemptive attackers. They did not wait for the other man to draw. They read the situation, made their decision, and moved before their opponent had fully committed to the same conclusion. Doc Holliday was famous for this. A man dying of tuberculosis, physically frail, often drunk. He survived numerous confrontations not through physical superiority, but through a willingness to act at the precise moment when hesitation would be fatal. He understood something fundamental about violence, that the man who is still deciding whether to fight is already losing to the man who has decided. The draw itself, when it happened, was nothing like the movies. There was no dramatic pause, no locked gaze, no moment of suspended time. A practiced draw from a holster in the 1870s and 1880s took somewhere between a quarter of a second and half a second for a genuinely skilled man. The average person, untrained, might take 1 to 2 seconds. That gap, that fraction of a second, was the entire margin between life and death. And it was not won through some mystical gift of speed. It was won through thousands of repetitions, through muscle memory so deeply ingrained that the conscious mind was almost bypassed entirely. The hand moved before the brain had finished forming the thought. The sound of a gunshot in an enclosed space or even on an open street is not the crisp crack that film sound designers give you. It is a concussive, disorienting explosion that temporarily impairs hearing and can cause genuine confusion about where the shot came from. In a saloon, with low ceilings and wooden walls, the acoustic shock of a single gunshot was enough to send everyone in the room diving for cover, regardless of whether they were involved. Witnesses to real gunfights frequently reported being unable to accurately describe what happened because the sensory overload was so complete. And then, there was the matter of actually hitting your target. Even at close range, under the physiological conditions of a real gunfight, accuracy was far from guaranteed. Documented accounts of Old West shootings are filled with cases where multiple shots were fired and nobody was hit, or where men were hit in non-fatal locations and the fight continued. The human body is surprisingly resilient to gunshot wounds in the short term. Adrenaline can mask pain and maintain function for minutes after a wound that will eventually prove fatal. There are documented cases of men who were mortally wounded continuing to fight, continuing to shoot, continuing to move, for far longer than seems physiologically possible. This is why the most dangerous gunfighters of the era did not aim for center mass and hope for the best. They aimed for the head, or they aimed to put their opponent on the ground immediately, understanding that a wounded man with a gun is still a man with a gun. The clinical brutality of this calculation is something the romantic mythology of the West carefully obscures. These were not honorable duels in the European tradition, with seconds and rules and a physician standing by. They were attempts to kill another human being as efficiently as possible before that human being killed you. Consider the famous gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, on October 26, 1881. It has been mythologized beyond recognition, but the documented reality is instructive. The entire confrontation lasted approximately 30 seconds. 30 seconds. In that time, roughly 30 shots were fired in an alley barely 15 feet wide. 3 men were killed. 3 were wounded. The survivors described chaos, smoke, screaming, and a confusion so complete that even the participants were not entirely certain of the sequence of events afterward. This was not a duel. It was a close-range firefight between men who were terrified, furious, and operating on pure instinct and training. The aftermath of a gunfight was something the movies skip almost entirely, and it is perhaps the most revealing part of the whole experience. Men who had just killed another human being in a gunfight did not holster their weapons and walk calmly into the sunset. They shook, they vomited, they sat down in the street because their legs would not support them. The adrenaline crash that follows extreme violence is physiologically brutal, and even the most hardened gunfighters were not immune to it. Wyatt Earp, after the OK Corral, described a period of profound psychological disturbance that lasted for days. Wild Bill Hickok, after killing his first man in a genuine gunfight, reportedly sat alone for hours afterward, unable to speak. The legal consequences were also nothing like the movies suggest. Killing a man in the Old West, even in what you considered self-defense, was not automatically excused. Coroners' juries were convened, witnesses were questioned, men were arrested, tried, and sometimes hanged for killings that they believed were justified. The Earp brothers and Doc Holliday were arrested after the OK Corral and faced a lengthy legal proceeding before being cleared. The idea that a gunfighter could simply walk away from a killing without consequence was a fantasy that served the mythology, but bore little relationship to the actual legal landscape of frontier towns, which were often more legally sophisticated than their reputation suggests. There is also the question of what it did to a man over time. The psychological cost of living in a world where lethal violence was a constant possibility, where you might be called upon to kill or be killed at any moment, was enormous. Many of the most famous gunfighters of the era died young, not from gunshots but from alcoholism, from disease, from the accumulated weight of a life lived at that pitch of constant readiness. Doc Holliday died of tuberculosis at 36, but those who knew him said the disease had been racing against the whiskey for years. John Wesley Hardin, who claimed to have killed over 40 men, spent 17 years in prison and was shot in the back of the head in a saloon at 42. The romantic image of the gunfighter riding into the sunset obscures the reality that most of them burned out fast and died badly. What the mythology of the Old West gunfight actually represents is something deeply human: our need to impose order and meaning on chaos, to find in violence a kind of clarity and justice that real life rarely provides. The quick-draw duel, with its implicit rules and its clean resolution, is a fantasy of a world where the right man wins, where skill and courage are perfectly rewarded, where death comes swiftly and without ambiguity. The real Old West offered none of those comforts. It offered dust and noise and confusion and the terrible randomness of a bullet that might find you or might not, regardless of how fast your hand was or how pure your cause. And yet, understanding the reality does not diminish the fascination. If anything, it deepens it. Because the men who lived in that world, who faced those conditions, who made those calculations, and lived with those consequences, were not superhuman. They were ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, shaped by a time and place that demanded a kind of readiness most of us will never know. When you understand what a real gunfight in the Old West actually cost, in nerve and in blood and in the long aftermath of a life defined by violence, the mythology becomes something more than entertainment. It becomes a window into the raw, unfiltered experience of human beings trying to survive in a world that offered them very little margin for error and no guarantee of tomorrow. That is the real story of the Old West duel. Not the clean draw and the clean shot and the clean walk away, but the shaking hands, the deafening noise, the 30 seconds of chaos, and the long quiet years of living with what you did. That is the story worth knowing.